At 51, after carrying one of HBO's biggest dramas, leading Star Wars and joining the Avengers, Pedro Pascal is finally doing something Hollywood somehow never gave him before. What Vanity Fair calls his first true leading film role. Not his first job, not his first franchise. The first movie built for him to carry, which is wild, because right now, Pedro Pascal seems less like an actor Hollywood discovered and more like a public utility Hollywood cannot function without. But this overnight success took about 20 years. He nearly chose another career. Friends helped him buy food. One audition looked terrible and changed everything. And the role that made him globally famous hid his face. So how did the man Hollywood barely noticed become the man audiences refused to ignore? The answer starts long before a helmet, a zombie, or a red cape. Pedro was 9 months old when his parents fled Chile during Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. The family first received asylum in Denmark, then built a life in San Antonio, Texas. His parents were young political refugees raising 2 children while trying to begin again in a language and country that were not their own. For Pedro, movies became more than entertainment. When his mother, Veronica, could not find a babysitter, she sometimes left him at a theater. At 7, he could sit through multiple showings of Poltergeist and come home ready to reenact the entire haunting. At home, the sound of HBO starting a movie sent him running through the house. The color purple moved him so intensely that his mother had to take him outside to catch his breath. Years later, he would lead 2 of that network's defining shows. But first, he was simply the kid who wanted the screen close enough to swallow him whole, and who already understood that a performance could rearrange somebody watching it. Then his family moved to Orange County. The palm trees looked perfect, middle school did not. Pascal has described being bullied for being sensitive, artistic, attention-seeking, in other words, for displaying almost every quality audiences would eventually love him for. His mother understood what the school around him did not. She moved him into arts education, where being obsessed with movies was no longer evidence that something was wrong. It was material. It was language. It might even be a future. At 18, he moved to New York to study acting at NYU Tisch. There, he met Sarah Paulson and a circle of young performers who would remain in his life for decades. The dream was finally becoming serious. The work, however, had not received the memo. Graduation did not produce a montage of auditions, applause, and a tastefully framed apartment. It produced the real actor starter pack. Tiny roles, unstable money, restaurant shifts, and the ability to hear no without letting the next customer know. And then, at 24, the scale of every professional disappointment changed. His mother died. Pascal flew to Santiago for the funeral, then returned to pilot season carrying a grief so large that losing another television job barely registered beside it. This is where a polished success story usually cuts forward. Ours cannot, because the years after that loss explain the actor audiences later met. The sadness behind the humor, the vulnerability inside the toughness, and the stubborn instinct to protect anyone more fragile than himself. 6 months after his mother's death, Pascal fostered a pit bull mix named Greta and quickly kept her. In New York, after bar shifts and restaurant work, she gave him one living reason to come home to an apartment he can barely afford. He is remembered walking Greta late at night so he could deposit a crumpled stack of tips at an ATM. That image matters, not because poverty makes an artist noble, but because this was not a short, photogenic struggle before the inevitable win. It dragged through his 20s and well into his 30s. Pascal later said he believed that reaching 30 without a real career meant the dream was probably over. So he looked at nursing school. He considered becoming a theater teacher. Here's the part the grind harder speeches usually edit out. He did not survive alone. His sister, Javiera, lent him small amounts of money. Friends bought groceries and dinner. Sarah Paulson shared per diem cash from her own jobs and helped with a car. They were not handing him fame. They were buying him time, the most expensive thing a struggling artist needs. Pascal calls them his angels. His sister describes a simpler family rule. They would not allow him to give up. That does not make the story less inspirational. It makes it honest. Talent matters. Endurance matters. But sometimes the distance between almost quit and one more audition is a meal, $40, a borrowed car, or somebody insisting you are not finished. Pedro kept working. He wrote and directed with the Labyrinth Theater Company. He traveled for regional theater, leading New York for stages in Oregon, Washington, D.C., Boston, and Cape Cod. On television, he became a familiar stranger, the person you recognize from one episode of Buffy, another corner of Law & Order, one courtroom, one crime scene, one doomed guest role. It was not glamorous, but it was repetition under pressure. On The Good Wife, he finally appeared in 6 episodes as prosecutor Nathan Landry, one of his first recurring television parts. Then The Mentalist let him play Marcus Pike, a credible romantic alternative rather than the weakly suspect or victim. Progress? Absolutely. Range? Increasingly obvious. Stardom? Not remotely. Hollywood had learned his face without learning his name. By his late 30s, Pascal had a resume many actors would respect, and a life that still felt financially breakable. He was not waiting for someone to discover a raw beginner. He was waiting for the industry to notice the experienced actor already standing in the room. Then, in 2013, one of the younger actors Pascal was helping received an audition for a new character on Game of Thrones, Prince Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper. Pascal saw the material and recognized an opportunity. He was 38. He recorded 17 pages on an iPhone and sent the tape to Sarah Paulson. The video was vertical. The image was rough. It looked less like the birth of a television icon and more like someone testing whether the front camera worked. The footage looked amateur. The performance did not. Paulson sent it to her friend Amanda Peet, who showed it to her husband, Game of Thrones co-creator David Benioff. Connections opened a door. They did not perform the scene. The intensity, danger, humor, and grief on that tiny screen belonged to Pascal. Oberyn appeared in only 7 episodes. That was enough. On Pascal's first day, he faced Peter Dinklage in one of the character's most important dialogue scenes, hardly the gentle warm-up a nervous newcomer might request. Pascal entered television's biggest fantasy drama as if he had been waiting his entire life to make confidence look dangerous. He flirted, fought, demanded justice, and made viewers invest in a man marked for catastrophe. It was the perfect first breakthrough because it compressed everything he could do: physical command, sharp comedy, sensuality, rage, and pain that never needed a speech explaining itself. Pascal has summarized the result in 3 words: it changed his life. Hollywood finally knew his name. But notice what had really changed. Pedro had not suddenly become better at 38. The industry finally gave an already developed actor a role large enough to reveal the work he had been building in smaller rooms for years. There is a cruel little detail in the timing. Greta, the dog who had carried him through the broke years, died around the period of his Game of Thrones break. The life she had helped him survive was finally changing, just as hers ended. One role could make him memorable. The next had to prove he was sustainable. Narcos did that. As DEA agent Javier Peña, Pascal moved from scene-stealing guest actor to his first series regular job, the stability he had chased for years. Across 3 seasons, filmed largely in Colombia, Narcos replaced Oberyn's flamboyant heat with something leaner: watchfulness, exhaustion, moral compromise. Javier became even more central after the Pablo Escobar story moved on, forcing Pascal to carry more of the series without the theatrical weaponry that made Oberyn instantly magnetic. This was not the Red Viper wearing a badge. It was evidence that Pascal could hold a long story without asking every scene to look at him. Then came the most Pedro Pascal twist imaginable. After spending 2 decades trying to be seen, he landed the title role in the first live-action Star Wars series, and spent most of it behind a metal helmet. When The Mandalorian premiered in 2019, Din Djarin could not charm the audience with a smile or signal pain with his eyes. Pascal had to build a character through voice, restraint, breath, timing, and the tiny cracks in a professional code. The physical role was, and remains, a collaboration. Brendan Wayne helped establish Mando's gunslinger physical language. Lateith Crowder brought specialized action work. Pascal supplied performance, voice, and the dramatic choices connecting those elements. The balance can shift from shot to shot, but the character has to feel like one person. Crediting that team does not shrink anyone's achievement. It explains why Mando feels coherent inside impossible armor. And then Grogu appeared. The hardened bounty hunter became a reluctant protector, then something closer to a father. Suddenly, Pascal's warmest quality was traveling through a face nobody could see. Hollywood covered the actor and accidentally revealed him. The series turned him into a global franchise lead. In May 2026, that journey reached theaters with The Mandalorian and Grogu. A kid who once ran toward the HBO theme was now carrying Star Wars onto an IMAX screen. But the helmet also created one last question. Could the vulnerability audiences imagined in his voice survive when the camera stayed on his face? The Last of Us answered with a character who wore no armor and somehow looked more protected than Mando. Joel Miller is a man trying to outlive grief by becoming emotionally unreachable. Pascal did not play him as a conventional action hero. He made strength look expensive. Every hard decision seemed to cost another piece of the person underneath. And opposite Bella Ramsey's Ellie, the pattern returned. A damaged man becomes responsible for someone younger, then discovers that protection is not the opposite of fear. It is what fear looks like when it decides to keep moving. The audience response was immediate. HBO reported 4.7 million US viewers on premiere night. The season 1 finale reached 8.2 million, a 75% increase from the debut, while the first 6 episodes were averaging more than 30 million US viewers across platforms. By 2025, HBO said the franchise's worldwide audience had pushed beyond 90 million since season 1 ended. This was no longer cult recognition or franchise anonymity. Pedro Pascal was the event. The industry followed. He won the Screen Actors Guild Award for Male Actor in a Drama Series. By 2025, the Television Academy listed 4 Emmy nominations across drama acting, comedy guest acting, and narration. The resume had finally caught up with the range. Then the internet gave him a promotion no agent could have planned: Daddy. It was affectionate, ridiculous, occasionally reductive, and completely revealing. Audiences were not only responding to toughness, they were responding to safety, humor, and vulnerability inside it. That is why the late rise mattered. Fame did not manufacture Pedro Pascal's personality in a laboratory. It arrived after grief, bad shifts, theater rooms, lasting friendships, and enough rejection to make his empathy feel lived rather than focus grouped. On February 4th, 2023, the anniversary of his mother's death, Pascal hosted Saturday Night Live. The date carried a private weight long before it became a career milestone. In the monologue, he thanked his parents for the courage that brought the family from Chile to the United States. His voice caught. Then he did what he had learned to do for years. He let the feeling remain and still made the night funny. Sarah Paulson joined him for a sketch. Coldplay's Chris Martin dedicated Fix You to Pedro and Veronica. Steven Spielberg, one of his childhood heroes, watched from the wings. A date associated with loss became, in Pascal's telling, something transformed. That is the emotional center of his story. Success did not erase the past. It gave him a different place to stand while remembering it. The same sensitivity that made childhood brutal had become the reason millions trusted him on screen. And once Hollywood understood that, it did what Hollywood does best. It scheduled Pedro Pascal for almost everything, apparently under the impression that sleep is an optional character choice. The projects widened fast, and the choices refused to settle into one brand. Gladiator 2 gave him another wounded fighter. Materialists made him a romantic possibility at the exact moment Pascal felt physically least convincing as one. Eddington pushed him into an American political nightmare. Then Marvel cast him as Reed Richards in the Fantastic Four: First Steps, placing one of cinema's most visible franchise futures on the shoulders of an actor once grateful for a single procedural episode. The casting drew predictable complaints. Too old, wrong face, wrong facial hair. A man who had once worried that success had missed him was now being told he was too visible for somebody else's mental picture. Progress can be extremely creative with its insults. But Reed Richards fit the larger career better than it first appeared. Pascal had become Hollywood's specialist in capable men whose control is covering fear. Mando behind Beskar, Joel behind brutality, Reed behind intelligence. Different armor? Same question underneath. Marvel has him scheduled to return in Avengers Doomsday in December 2026. Star Wars has already taken him to theaters. HBO gave him prestige and scale. From the outside, it looks like the finish line. From Pedro's perspective, one door was still strangely unopened. In July 2026, Vanity Fair introduced Behemoth, Tony Gilroy's drama about a gifted cellist entering the world of Hollywood film scoring. Gilroy admitted that before meeting Pascal, he worried the star might be superficial or flighty. 3-hour conversation changed that. The magazine framed the result as Pascal's first true leading film role. He was 51. Think about that. The man had led hit series, anchored global franchises, won a major acting prize, and become a model superhero. Yet the classic movie star assignment, a film resting primarily on him, arrived after all of it. And the role demanded a new kind of work. Pascal trained to make years of cello mastery believable, performing to Tchaikovsky. After swords, stun harnesses, armor, and apocalypse, he called the cello the hardest skill he had ever tried to fake convincingly. That may be the cleanest answer to why his career lasted long enough to explode. The success did not turn curiosity off. At 51, with nothing left to prove to the internet, he was still willing to look awkward, start at zero, and learn where to put the bow. Pedro Pascal's rise is often sold as a lesson in patience. That is only half true. Waiting by itself changes nothing. He kept practicing, kept working small, accepted help, built relationships that were real before they were useful, and stayed emotionally available in an industry that rewards armor. His breakthrough was not one miracle. Game of Thrones made people remember him. Narcos proved he could sustain a series. The Mandalorian made him global. The Last of Us showed the full emotional range hiding behind everything else. And now, Behemoth asks whether he can carry a film with no helmet, no superhero team, and no apocalypse. Just craft, family, legacy, and music. It is not the beginning of his career. It may be the first role that contains the whole journey. Hollywood's favorite overnight success took 20 years because the world met him late. The people who loved him did not. They saw the actor, protected the person, and kept the door open long enough for the industry to finally walk through it. So which role truly changed Pedro Pascal's life? Oberyn, Javier Peña, The Mandalorian, or Joel? Tell us below and subscribe to The Screen Report for the stories behind the screen.